In the bustling streets of downtown Chicago, where the winter wind cuts like daggers through worn-out coats, 14-year-old David noticed something unusual on his way home from basketball practice. Between the towering skyscrapers and busy sidewalks, an elderly man sat huddled in a doorway, his weathered face partially hidden beneath layers of tattered clothing. Most people hurried past, their eyes fixed on smartphones or the ground beneath their feet. But David wasn't most people. Despite the late hour and his mom's constant warnings about talking to strangers, something about the man's dignified posture, even in such dire circumstances, made him pause. "Sir, would you like my sandwich?" "I haven't touched it yet," David offered, pulling out his carefully wrapped lunch from his backpack. His mom had packed it this morning, but basketball practice had run late, and he'd grabbed pizza with his teammates instead. The man looked up, his piercing blue eyes holding a spark that seemed out of place given his current situation. "Thank you, young man," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth and refinement. "But I'd rather share it with you, if you don't mind keeping an old man company for a few minutes." What happened next would change both their lives forever. As they sat sharing the simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the man, who introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, began asking David about his life, his dreams, and his family. David found himself opening up about helping his single mom make ends meet by doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, and his dream of becoming a business owner someday. Little did David know that Mr. Thompson was watching him intently, noting every word, every gesture, because Mr. Thompson wasn't just another homeless person on the streets of Chicago. Behind his ragged appearance lay one of the city's most successful real estate developers, who had spent the past month living on the streets as part of a social experiment, seeking to understand the true character of people when they thought no one was watching. As the evening grew colder, David reluctantly stood up to leave. "I should head home before my mom worries," he said, zipping up his jacket. "Would you like my scarf? It's not much, but it might help with the cold." Mr. Thompson declined with a gentle smile, but his mind was already working on a plan. This young man's genuine kindness, shown without any expectation of reward, had touched something deep within him. He had found exactly what he had been looking for during his month-long experiment. "Thank you for your kindness, David," Mr. Thompson said, his voice taking on a mysterious tone. "Perhaps we'll meet again someday." What David didn't realize as he walked away that evening was that this chance encounter would soon lead to an opportunity beyond his wildest dreams, because Mr. Thompson had made a decision that would not only transform David's life, but would also prove that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the most extraordinary rewards. But first, Mr. Thompson had one more test in mind, one that would push David's character to its limits and reveal whether this young man was truly ready for what was about to come his way. The next morning, Mr. Thompson watched from across the street as David hurried to school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The boy stopped twice, once to help an elderly woman carry her groceries up the steps, and again to pick up scattered papers that had blown from a street vendor's stand. These small acts of kindness only confirmed what Mr. Thompson had observed the previous evening. But Mr. Thompson wasn't just interested in random acts of kindness. He needed to know if David possessed the resilience and judgment necessary for what he had in mind. Over the next week, Mr. Thompson orchestrated a series of subtle tests, each designed to reveal different aspects of David's character. On Monday, he arranged for David to find a wallet containing $500 on his way home from school. Without hesitation, David turned it in to the local police station, despite his family's tight financial situation. The previous night, he had overheard his mother on the phone, worrying about making rent that month. Wednesday brought a different kind of test. A well-dressed businessman, one of Mr. Thompson's associates, approached David outside the basketball court, offering him $1,000 to deliver a mysterious package across town. David politely but firmly declined, saying he didn't feel comfortable with the arrangement. Through it all, Mr. Thompson observed how David maintained his daily routine, helping at home, keeping up with his studies, and still finding time to assist neighbors with odd jobs. He noticed how the boy handled his money, carefully saving a portion of his earnings from mowing lawns and running errands. What impressed Mr. Thompson most was David's relationship with his mother, Sarah. Despite their financial struggles, their bond was unshakable. Sarah worked 2 jobs, as a hospital receptionist during the day and waitressing 3 nights a week, yet still made time to attend David's basketball games and help with his homework. One evening, Mr. Thompson overheard them discussing David's future. "I know things are tight, Mom," David said, "but I've been saving up from my lawn mowing money. Maybe I can help with the bills this month." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "Baby, that's your college fund. You keep saving. We'll make it work, we always do." This conversation stirred something in Mr. Thompson. He remembered his own humble beginnings long before he had built his real estate empire. His success hadn't come from a privileged background or lucky breaks, but from people who recognized his potential and gave him opportunities to prove himself. As the second week of observation began, Mr. Thompson set his most challenging test in motion. He arranged for a local business owner, another associate, to offer David an after-school job. The catch? It would mean quitting the basketball team he loved and giving up his community service at the local food bank. The salary was significant, especially for a 14-year-old. Mr. Thompson watched as David wrestled with the decision, seeing how he methodically weighed his options. After 3 days of careful consideration, David declined the offer, explaining to the business owner that while he appreciated the opportunity, he couldn't abandon his commitments to his team and the community. This was exactly what Mr. Thompson had hoped to see, not just kindness, but integrity, wisdom, and the ability to think long-term. Now it was time for the final phase of his plan. On a crisp Saturday morning, Mr. Thompson returned to the doorway where he and David had first met. This time, however, he wore a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair neatly trimmed. He had arranged for David to pass by on his way to the food bank. As David approached, Mr. Thompson could see the moment of recognition in the boy's eyes. David stopped in his tracks, confusion written across his face as he tried to reconcile the well-dressed businessman before him with the homeless man he met 2 weeks ago. "Hello, David," Mr. Thompson said warmly. "I believe we shared a sandwich here not too long ago." David's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Mr. Thompson, but I don't understand. Would you mind sitting with me for a moment? I have a story to share with you, and possibly an opportunity, if you're interested." As they sat on a nearby bench, Mr. Thompson began to explain his experiment and why he had chosen to test David's character. He revealed his true identity as the founder of Thompson Real Estate Development, one of Chicago's largest property companies. But more importantly, he shared his vision for a mentorship program he'd been developing, one that would give promising young people the guidance and resources they needed to achieve their dreams. David listened intently, his mind racing with questions. But before Mr. Thompson could finish explaining his proposal, an unexpected event would force both of them to prove that their connection was about more than just opportunity and success. Because sometimes the true measure of a person isn't in how they handle good fortune, but in how they respond when everything seems to fall apart. As Mr. Thompson began explaining his proposal, urgent shouts erupted from across the street. Smoke billowed from the windows of the food bank where David volunteered. The very place he was headed to that morning was now engulfed in flames. Without hesitation, David sprinted toward the building. Mr. Thompson called after him, but David had already disappeared through the front entrance. Inside, he found Mrs. Chen, the elderly coordinator, struggling to save boxes of donated food from the spreading fire. The smoke was getting thicker by the second. "David, you shouldn't be in here." Mrs. Chen coughed, trying to lift a heavy box of canned goods. "I'm not leaving you," David insisted, helping her with the box. The heat was intense, and the smoke made it difficult to breathe. They managed to save several boxes, but the fire was spreading rapidly. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson had called emergency services and was coordinating with bystanders to form a chain to help move the salvaged supplies. Despite his wealthy status, he worked alongside everyone else, his expensive suit covered in soot. The situation grew more desperate as they learned that the food bank's basement, where they stored most of their supplies for the upcoming holiday season, was also at risk. These supplies were meant to feed hundreds of families in need. David knew there were more volunteers in the basement. Despite the dangerous conditions, He made his way down there, using his shirt as a makeshift mask. He found 2 other volunteers, helping them navigate through the smoke-filled corridor to safety. The fire department arrived, but the damage was already extensive. As David watched the firefighters battle the blaze, he couldn't help but think about all the families who relied on the food bank. This was more than just a building burning. It was a lifeline for the community. Mr. Thompson observed David's reaction carefully. The boy wasn't just concerned about the immediate crisis. He was already thinking about its impact on the community. Even as paramedics checked him for smoke inhalation, David was making calls on his phone, reaching out to his basketball teammates and other volunteers. What happened next would test not just David's character, but Mr. Thompson's as well. Because while the fire was being contained, a much bigger challenge was unfolding, one that would force both of them to make decisions that would impact not just their lives, but the entire community. As David and Mr. Thompson stood amid the chaos, neither of them realized that this disaster would lead to an opportunity far greater than their original discussion. But first, they would have to confront a truth about the fire that would shake their newfound trust to its core. As the smoke cleared from the food bank, a local news crew arrived on the scene. The reporter immediately recognized Mr. Thompson, and suddenly the story shifted. Headlines flashed across social media. Billionaire developer spotted at burned food bank. Connection to recent property acquisitions. David's phone buzzed with messages from friends sharing links to articles suggesting Mr. Thompson's company had been buying properties in the neighborhood at suspiciously low prices after similar accidents. The implications were clear. Some believed the fire wasn't an accident at all. David felt his world spinning. The same man who'd offered him mentorship was now being accused of orchestrating the destruction of a community cornerstone. His mother called, her voice trembling, warning him to stay away from Mr. Thompson. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson pulled David aside, his face grave. "I need to tell you something," he began, but before he could continue, they were interrupted by the fire chief announcing their preliminary findings. The fire's origin appeared suspicious. Adding to the tension, David discovered documents in the salvaged boxes revealing that the food bank building was the last property holding out against a major development project. The property owner's name was redacted, but the deadline for the sale was set for the following week. The community quickly divided into 2 camps. Some defended Mr. Thompson, citing his previous charitable works, while others called for an investigation. David found himself caught in the middle, holding a piece of information that could change everything, something he'd seen the night he first met Mr. Thompson, but hadn't understood until now. As protesters gathered outside Thompson Real Estate Development's downtown office, David faced the biggest decision of his young life. The truth he held could either save or destroy the man who'd offered to change his life. But before he could decide what to do, another revelation emerged that would change everything they thought they knew about the situation. The crucial piece of information David held was a conversation he'd overheard that first night. Mr. Thompson on a phone call, fighting to stop the development project, not advance it. Racing to Thompson's office through the protest crowd, David found the businessman surrounded by reporters and angry community members. "Wait," David shouted above the chaos. "Mr. Thompson was trying to save the food bank. I heard him that night, arguing with someone about protecting community spaces." He pulled out his phone, playing a recording he'd accidentally captured while approaching Mr. Thompson that first evening. The recording revealed the truth. Mr. Thompson had been working undercover to expose corrupt developers who were pressuring local businesses to sell. His homeless experiment wasn't just about finding someone worthy to mentor. It was about witnessing firsthand how these developers were affecting the community. But the biggest revelation came from Sarah, David's mother, who pushed through the crowd. As a hospital receptionist, she'd recently processed insurance papers for the real culprit, the food bank's own board chairman, who'd been secretly working with the developers and stood to gain millions from the sale. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, finally able to reveal his master plan. He'd already purchased the surrounding properties, not to develop them, but to protect them. The documents found in the food bank were part of his evidence gathering. His real mission was creating a community trust to preserve these spaces forever. The chairman was arrested, and Mr. Thompson announced a surprise. He was donating his entire real estate portfolio to the newly formed community trust. But he needed someone with true integrity to help lead it. Looking at David, he asked, "Ready for your first real business lesson?" As cameras flashed and the crowd cheered, David realized this was more than just a story about a homeless millionaire and a kind-hearted boy. It was about fighting for what's right, even when the truth seems impossible to believe. But just as everyone thought the story was over, an envelope arrived that would lead them to an even bigger conspiracy. The mysterious envelope contained files exposing a network of corrupt officials across multiple cities, all using similar tactics to exploit vulnerable communities. Mr. Thompson had unknowingly uncovered just the tip of the iceberg. This discovery would shape the next chapter of both his and David's lives. Over the next year, the community trust flourished under their joint leadership. David, balancing school and his new responsibilities, learned invaluable lessons about business, community service, and leadership. His mother, Sarah, joined the trust's board, bringing her healthcare expertise to help establish free medical clinics in their properties. The food bank was rebuilt, bigger and better than before. It became a model for other communities, combining food assistance with job training programs and small business incubation spaces. David's basketball teammates became regular volunteers, turning their team spirit into community action. Mr. Thompson kept his promise of mentorship, but with an unexpected twist. He learned as much from David as David learned from him. The young man's fresh perspective and unwavering moral compass helped reshape Thompson Real Estate's entire approach to development, prioritizing community needs over profit margins. Their story inspired a nationwide movement of community trusts, with people realizing that wealth and power could be used to uplift rather than exploit. Other business leaders followed Mr. Thompson's example, creating similar programs in their cities. 5 years later, David stood on stage at his high school graduation as valedictorian. Mr. Thompson sat proudly beside Sarah, both beaming as David shared his story. He spoke not of success measured in dollars, but in lives changed and communities strengthened. Sometimes, David concluded, the greatest test of character isn't in what we achieve for ourselves, but in what we do for others. And sometimes, the most valuable things we can offer aren't measured in money, but in kindness, trust, and the courage to stand up for what's right. As he stepped down from the podium, David caught Mr. Thompson's eye. They shared a knowing smile, both thinking of that cold evening years ago when a simple act of kindness changed not just their lives, but an entire community. The sandwich they shared had been more than just food. It was the beginning of a revolution in how people thought about wealth, power, and the true meaning of success. Mr. Thompson passed away peacefully 10 years later, leaving the bulk of his fortune to the community trust. In his will, he included a letter to David. "You taught me that true wealth isn't about what we own, but about what we give back. Continue the work we started, not just in buildings and businesses, but in building hope and opportunity for others." Today, David leads one of the country's largest community development organizations, continuing Mr. Thompson's legacy. He still keeps that old sandwich wrapper framed in his office, a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness can spark the biggest changes. And every winter evening, when he walks past that old doorway downtown, he stops to help anyone he finds there, sharing not just food, but hope, because he knows better than anyone that sometimes the person you help might just change your life forever. The story of the homeless millionaire and the kind-hearted boy became legend in Chicago, but its true impact wasn't in the dramatic twists and reveals. It was in the thousands of small acts of kindness it inspired, proving that when we reach out to help others, we often find our own greatest purpose. And so, the revolution of kindness continues, one simple act at a time, reminding us all that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the lives we touch and the communities we build together.